The title of this lecture is Sources of Crime Data, and I'm going to use it to introduce you to our most popular form of crime data that American citizens see. Basically, the reason is when you hear a politician or in the news, you hear crime is up or crime are down, where are they getting those numbers? How do they know that crime is up or crime is down? Next slide. Okay, so the data come from the Justice Department of the federal government. That should get your critical minds thinking, not because they're bad people or they have some sort of a conspiracy, but oftentimes the federal government does things that are not logical or that have significant gaps. And you'll kind of see there's some issues with UCR. The most popular one, the one that is most often cited in the media, so when you hear crime is up or crime is down, they're almost always citing the Uniform Crime Reports. It just so happens, as you'll see by the end of this lecture, it happens to be the worst one of all of both of them. A far better one is the National Crime Victimization Survey. I'm unsure why they continue to use the media, meaning the Uniform Crime Reports, mainly probably because it's been around for a long time and you can track data over time. So there's some usefulness in that. And as you'll find out that there are a few crimes that it does a fairly good job at. But in general, if you wanted a much better source of crime data, you would use the National Crime Victimization Survey, which is addressed in a separate lecture. It is a social scientific survey data, sort of if you've maybe ever heard of a CNN poll or something like that. So it's actually a very quality social science sample, and it's very large. But in this lecture, we're just going to talk about UCR. Okay, so the Uniform Crime Reports is collected by the FBI. They actually require police departments or ask police departments to send them the data. It is based upon crimes known to the police. So that means that in order to count a crime, it's either reported by citizens, right? Somebody calls it in or reports it. Or it could also, the reason why they say known to the police, it could also be if a cop observes one, or for example, let's just say that somebody's murdered and nobody reports it, but the cops find the body, right? That could also be counted if they wanted to count it. And in a murder, they would. Okay, so that's why they say crimes known to the police. That's what's known as their sampling frame. So they're only able to count crimes known to the police. And what that means is anything that wasn't reported to the cops or the cops do not know about, they are unable to count. Okay, so it's broken down into two types, Part 1 and Part 2 crimes. Part 1 offenses are our most serious crimes, and they go in order. As you'll see in a second, it's very important. Murder, forcible rape, robbery, aggravated assault, burglary, larceny, that's sort of the same thing as theft, that's why they put theft, motor vehicle theft, and since 1979, arson. So if you'll notice the order there, it starts at the most serious type of crime, and it gets less serious as we go down the list. What they do is they'll compile it into a crime index. So they'll usually say per 1,000 people, there were this many murders or this many car thefts. Oftentimes you'll see it in per 100,000 residents. So what that really is, it's just a percentage really, but it gives you an idea. So for every 100,000 people, here's how many occur. Okay. It's those two things, especially the per 100,000, is much better than percentages when the percentages drop below 1% because it's easier to put your mind around it, in my opinion. The mathematically inclined, it doesn't matter to them. The thing is when multiple events occur at the same time, so if the cops became aware, either in some way of I call it a multi-crime event, where more than one of those crimes in the Part 1 offenses occur at one time, only the most serious one is going to be recorded or counted by UCR. So if somebody murdered somebody, then broke into a house, murdered somebody, or maybe they'd forcibly rape them first, then they'd murder somebody, then they got out in the street, they robbed somebody, they assaulted them, they stole something in the house, stole the getaway car, only the murder would be reported. So only the most serious event is reported. Arson breaks the hierarchy rule. I think this was added in the 70s when there was a lot of insurance fraud for arson. And for some reason now, if arson occurs, so do that whole same situation, break in the house, rape, blah, 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 and they torch the house, both the murder and arson are reported. Don't ask me why. It makes no sense. That's sort of like the critical thinking, right? It was made for political reasons, not for logical reasons. Okay. And in the next, so the hierarchy rule, report the most serious crime in that order, right? If there's more than one of those crimes that occur in one event, they only count the most serious one, with the exception of arson, which breaks the hierarchy rule. And we'll talk about the clearance rate in much more detail on the next slide. But basically, the clearance rate, it does not measure crime, it measures policing. So it takes basically it's the percentage of crimes that are reported. Take all the crimes that are reported, what percentage of them result in an arrest? So if there were, so many murders, what percentages of them result in an arrest? And that crime is called cleared. So it's the clearance rate. I remember one time watching The Wire, a show that's about the Baltimore Police Department, and they were talking about clearance rates. So that's what it is. It's basically the proportion of crimes that result in an arrest. It doesn't measure crime, it measures policing. And we'll talk much more about it in the next slide.
Okay, I wanted to add an update about the clearance rate resulting from a great question I received from a student, as well as I checked it out with a good friend of mine who actually compiles the UCR data for the state of Hawaii. Just real quickly to remind you what a clearance rate is. Okay, the clearance rate is the proportion of crimes that result in arrest. So the cops have a number of reported crimes, and then they report the number of crimes that they have an arrest for. Now, if you think about it, the clearance rate does not measure crime per se. What it measures is policing, most specifically policing effectiveness, or basically how good the cops are at solving crimes. It does not measure crime. A lot of people will write a paper on this issue and they always say clearance rate has something to do with crime, and it doesn't. It won't make crime data better. What it does is it would, if you were to fix this in some way, we would improve the way we measure policing in some fashion. I want to explain to you a little bit of why, again, a cleared crime does not equal a solved crime. So in a sense, the way they do it now, the clearance rate inflates the public's idea of how many crimes the cops actually solve, actually the proportion or percentage of crimes they actually solve. If you think about it, the notion of a cleared crime suggests that an individual crime has been solved, and this is not true in two ways. Okay, number one, just because somebody has been arrested for a crime doesn't mean they actually committed the crime and it's been solved. Okay, so in the United States criminal justice system, conviction is what we equal with a solved crime, not an arrest. Okay, just you're arrested, you're charged with the crime. You must be convicted to actually, well, we say, okay, you're guilty of this crime. So by just using arrest rather than convictions, the clearance rate makes the cops look better than they are. However, don't just go crazy with that notion. Okay, now here's another important thing, and this is the main thing that I learned new from my friend who does the UCR data for Hawaii. Okay, clearances and individual crimes are not connected. Okay, so clearances are not connected to their original reported crime. Okay, take car thefts for an example. According to the reporting rules, they simply count the number of car thefts and the number of car theft arrests for that particular year. Using those two numbers, they can create what's called a clearance rate. Okay. Now, there's no way to know which individual car theft for a year actually resulted in an arrest. Okay, so let's pretend your car was stolen in 2006. Okay, but they never arrested someone for your car theft until 2009. Okay, the cleared car theft would show up in 2009 reporting year, not in 2006. Okay, so there's no connection between the actual crime that was reported and whether or not that arrest was for that actual crime. Now, to be fair, you don't say, well, that's totally junk, because the idea is that they all even out over time. So even though your car theft was not reported as cleared in 2006, another one probably was, and that one probably also was not committed in 2006. So it probably all works its way out in the end. Probably the major problem is that arrests don't really mean solved. However, here's what you need to understand. The typical suggestion, and it makes sense on face value, is say, well, we should make the cops keep track of both convictions and arrests so we can know how many crimes are actually solved. And we could also make them connect these individual crimes. If we were to ask them to do that, it's not easy, and it's most importantly not cheap. Okay, it would be a bureaucratic nightmare to ask the police to keep track of each individual car theft or any other crime time and its associated arrest over the years. Okay, to connect the crimes, if you will, and to keep track of that over the years. The same could be said if we asked the police to track individual convictions. Okay, it seems simple enough to ask the cops to do this, but you may be arrested in 2006. However, your actual conviction may not occur until, say, 2008. But it's not simple to do this, and let me explain just real briefly. I'll use Hawaii as an example. The cops arrest people and keep records of that on their own computer system. Then the courts, they keep track of convictions using their computer system. Okay, they are all then compiled on this separate sort of criminal history database in Hawaii that keeps track of individual arrests and convictions. Now, theoretically, you could do this, okay? And while it might seem simple to you to require somebody to program the computer to keep track of these things, in practice it is exceedingly time-consuming and difficult. I know from personal experience now doing my study on drunk driving. Those data downloads, we got a data download from that criminal history database, and they are not simple to program, and it takes a tremendous amount of time and effort to make sense of that in order to do that. Okay, so it would require spending a whole bunch of money and would take resources away from the cops on the street if you were to ask the UCR to do this. Okay, so you can suggest this is a way to fix UCR, but you must be willing to accept the loss of cops on the street. Okay, or be willing to increase the police officers' budget substantially. Okay, do you accept either of these trade-offs? There is no perfect policy. Okay, so you could say, well, that doesn't make sense. We should make them keep track of both convictions, and they should connect individual crimes. I think that's intellectually a very good suggestion. It would make for more accurate data on policing effectiveness. Notice I didn't say crime. Okay, but there is if you do that, you're either going to have to increase the police budget substantially, or you say, no, you guys have to, the most likely solution is, no, you guys have to do it with your current budgets, and what are the police, if the police are required to do that, that's going to take cops off the street. So you have to be able to accept these trade-offs, if you will. So if you write a fixed UCR paper in this course, you must acknowledge this policy difficulty, and you must acknowledge that the clearance rate measures policing effectiveness, if you will. How well the police are doing in solving crimes, if you will, purportedly. It does not measure crime. The clearance rate does not measure crime. You must indicate these two things. That'll help your thinking if you do this. A lot of people who write that paper in a course of mine mess this up with the clearance rate. Alrighty, that's the end of this update.
Okay, so let me describe the Part 1 offenses for you. They break them up into violent crimes and property crimes. Violent crimes are crimes against people, if you will. And so they are murder, forcible rape, robbery. I'll talk more about robbery later, and aggravated assault. And then property crimes are crimes against property, meaning they don't necessarily hurt somebody physically, but what they do is they take things of value. So burglary, you'll find out that that means you break into somebody's house. Motor vehicle theft, larceny or theft, and arson, which is really its own type if you think about it. It's since it was added later. Okay, and we'll go into much more definitions later in the next coming slides, where I'll tell you what each of these mean specifically. Okay, here I would like to just explain some of the definitions about UCR. First of all, the UCR definitions are not as same as the legal definitions. So the way the United States was set up way back in the day when there was 13 colonies, they each had their own functioning criminal justice system. So that legacy is still with us. So what that means is for most state crimes, most crimes you can think of, and the ones that are in UCR are state crimes, meaning each state has their own various legal definitions. So UCR has to use one definition, for example, aggravated assault, so they can count all of them in the nation. So Hawaii and UCR may have slightly different definitions of what an aggravated assault is. UCR is going to use their definition just so, why? So they can count all aggravated assaults across the nation. They have to use a single definition or they won't be able to count them across the nation. Give you a local example from Hawaii. Pretend we wanted to count the number of surfers across the nation. We ask, are you a surfer? In Hawaii, let's pretend that we use anybody who rides a wave. We don't care what you use, boogie board, paddle board, anything, right? Regular surfing, and let's pretend in North Dakota, what they think of as surfing is what we would sort of call traditional surfing, where you're on a board with fins, and you have to start on your belly paddling, and then you need to stand up on your feet, right? So if you use those two definitions, you would come up with a different count of the number of surfers. So the same thing with UCR. That's why they have to use a single definition, which may or may not differ from the state definition across the nation. Okay, so that's why they do it. Okay, murder. Murder, it's not just first and second degree murder, the thing you would think of when you watch those crime shows on television or movies. You'll note that it doesn't include suicide, but it does include attempted murder. The thing about murder is that it's probably, if you wanted to use UCR to count a certain crime, it's the best one to use. Number one, the other source of crime data I will introduce you to is a survey where they ask people if they've been a victim of crime in the last year. You cannot ask somebody, have you been a victim of murder? I guess you could say attempted murder, obviously, if it didn't work. But murder is actually, the murder rate is probably close to the actual murder rate across the nation, simply because almost all murders are at some point known to the police. I mean, you got to think about it you got to be somebody who's like homeless or just doesn't have any friends and family that wouldn't report your murder. It wouldn't become known to the police. So in general, it's a pretty good count of murder for the United States. And that's due because of its seriousness. Most murders get either reported or known to the cops eventually. They find somebody laying on the street or whatever. Forcible rape. What I want you to notice here is that they've changed the definition. Before 2012, it only had females. You'll notice that the definition after that has both, any gender, doesn't matter. If you look at the UCR data, which I hope you will, you'll note then after 2012, they provide both counts, sort of the legacy definition and the current definition. And that's actually a good thing because it allows you, even though we would say that that forcible rape definition before 2012 wasn't perfect, but what it does do is allow us to at least get a general idea of the trend of females over time, right? If they just didn't keep counting that legacy definition, we wouldn't know how that particular version of rape changed over time. So that's a good thing, meaning that they count both that they changed it and that they continue to count the old one, simply because it allows us to track over time. Robbery, that requires face-to-face interaction. That means I see you, you see me, and I say, give me your money, sucker. Um, so it requires force or the threat of force. Okay, UCR defines it as the taking or attempting to take anything of value from the care, custody, or control of a person by persons by force or threat of force or violence or by putting the victim in fear. I'm not going to test you on that, but just know that it's I see you, you see me, and I have to either use force on you or threaten to use force on you. I used to always mix this up with burglary, which you'll see on the next slide, because we'll often say, oh, my house was robbed. And what we really mean is that we were a victim of a burglary, because you don't normally see the person who breaks into your house and steals stuff. I suppose if you saw them, that muddies the situation. So just think if that's more like on the street or somewhere where I see you, you see me, give me your money, sucker. That's what robbery is. Aggravated assault, here the key is that it differs from simple assault in that there's the use of a weapon or the victim requires medical attention. According to my friend in Hawaii who counts UCR data for Hawaii, he says it means internal injuries, broken bones, stitches, and it wouldn't include minor things like scrapes, black eyes, etc. Okay, so on to the next slide. Okay, for property crimes, where again, remember that UCR definitions are not as same as the legal definitions as I went into in much more greater detail. Okay, so they have to come up with one definition recall, for each of these crimes. Okay, so burglary, it's basically unlawful entry into a locked or unlocked structure, including attempts. Somebody asked in Hawaii, what about carports? Because that's kind of cool. Like in Hawaii, we have a lot of carports, not necessarily closed garages. I forget the answer. I asked my friend who collects data for UCR. I forget the answer on that one. So basically, it's going into a structure to steal stuff. Okay. Again, I used to think that when somebody's house was burgled, I would say my house was robbed. I used to have my house robbed as a kid several times. But it really was that you were a victim of burglary, not robbery. Larceny, that's just theft. So it's theft of any amount, but excluding embezzlement, forgery, bad checks, and con games. So if you think about that, so it's theft of any amount. It's interesting. It includes rustling, which is stealing livestock. It excludes white collar crime, though. Okay, embezzlement, forgery, whatnot. That's a white collar crime, if you will. Motor vehicle theft. This is really funny. Basically, you're stealing something that moves. Obviously, most often it's going to be a car, motorcycle, moped. But it's the theft or attempted theft, so that means attempts are included, of a motor vehicle. A motor vehicle is self-propelled and runs on land, surface, and not rails. Motorboats, construction equipment, airplanes, and farming equipment are specifically excluded from this category. One time there was somebody who stole a tank and drove it down a road, and somebody asked me whether or not that would be included. I don't know. I would guess not, but I don't know. It's a rare occurrence. Again, arson's its own category, but it's the burning or attempted burning of property with or without attempt to defraud. Recall that it was started in the late 70s when there's a lot of insurance fraud. So basically, if it looks like the fire was started by human beings, regardless of whether or not they were trying to rip off insurance companies, it is counted. And then recall again, it breaks the hierarchy rule. So that would be something that is probably close to what is counted. They say the same thing about motor vehicle theft. Assuming that you're insured, it's probably fairly good. Assuming that, at least catches the people who have insurance and they need to have a police report to collect on it. Obviously, it's not perfect because a lot of people who might not have insurance don't bother. Part 2 offenses are what they call the quote-unquote less serious crimes. They are not used by police reports, but they're used for arrests. Okay, the reason why is that many of them are the so-called victimless crimes, and such they're likely to be unreported to the police. That's why they use arrests. So I won't give you the complete arrest, but something like simple assault, forgery, fraud, embezzlement, drug laws, gambling, vice, public drunkenness, prostitution. People who commit those crimes, they don't tend to call in the cops and go, hey, I just went down to Chinatown and went gambling. Okay, so that's why they use arrested. Note that embezzlement is included here, which is a white collar crime, right? So not only does it have to be embezzlement, but they have to have made an arrest. In the big financial meltdown of 2008, 2009 in the United States, which was a huge event, not as of 2018, not a single bank executive was convicted of a criminal offense. I should say maybe they went to jail. Maybe somebody was, but not many, if any. Next slide. Okay, there are many criticisms of UCR. Surprisingly, they come in the too much and too little and all in between forms. Okay, the too little. Crime, basically what that says is crime is worse than UCR would have us believe. Some authors have said, with the exception of murder and car theft, most of the Part 1 crimes are probably underreported. Okay, if you think about it, that makes sense. I think it's the best criticism. Many times citizens don't report crimes because either they're afraid to contract to the police, they're afraid of reprisal in their neighborhoods or embarrassment. Like me as a kid, they don't think the cops can do anything about it. I had my bicycle stolen so many times, I've stopped calling the cops about it. Or they just accept victimization as a part of life. So there's a lot of reasons why people don't bother to let the cops know about certain crimes. And then Part 2 offenses, it makes sense as victimless crimes. They're never going to be reported. And they tend to not, it's really hard to come up with arrests for things like prostitution, gambling, etc. Okay. So basically the idea would be they don't provide a very complete picture of crime. It's vastly undercounts it. That's true, I think, for the most part. And the hierarchy rule especially undercounts crime. I don't know what proportion of crime occurs in a multi-crime event, meaning more than one Part 1 offense occurs at the same time. But since they don't count them all, they're missing at least some proportion of crime that goes unrecorded, even though it's reported. Okay, so the hierarchy rule is another reason why it really does undercount crime. The too much one is a little bit more subtle. Okay, basically it says by counting in temps, it inflates the crime rate. I'll read you a quote from a very well-known scholar. In an effort to bite out the budgets, take a bite out of the budgets of other government agencies, Department of Justice and its law enforcement bureaucracies, especially the FBI and National Institutes of Justice, consistently inflate or bias reports of data on crime. These same federal agencies hand out lucrative research grants to criminologists who uncritically accept the Department of Justice's crime control perspective. But of all the misleading and distorted information about crime, none is more damaging than the oldest established source of national data on crime rates and trends, the FBI's UCR. Okay, let me give you an example of murder being overcounted. FBI instructions to local police departments direct that if a police officer finds a dead body and believes the person was murdered, the event is recorded of a murder. It matters not if the next day the coroner says it was a suicide or the prosecutor later determines it was a justifiable homicide or an accidental death. Okay, I won't go into reading the rest of the quote, but by counting attempts, attempted assault, attempted whatever, it inflates the rate. And we have seen that, as I'll say, I'll cover it in the next 2 bullet points a little bit in more detail. Okay. All right, some other criticisms of UCRs that crimes known to the police is ambiguous. What they mean by this is that it's generated by citizen complaints for the most part, and a complaint doesn't mean an actual crime has taken place. The UCR doesn't even require an arrest or an investigation. So that, here's to give you a quote: the only requirement is that someone somewhere, for some reason, believed that a crime may have been committed and reported it to the police. Okay, maybe. I think it's kind of a weak criticism, to be honest with you. But okay, it's not the biggest problem. This next one I think is a little bit more salient. What they mean, it underestimates crime, so it undercounts crime, but it over dramatizes that crime that exists. Okay, so what that means is that if you look at what they'll give you is a violent crime index and a property crime index. So they collapse those crimes and they tell you the rate or for each of those. And the issue with this is that the least serious kind of property crime or the least serious kind of violent crime are the most common. They're the most, so those, the least serious type of violent or property crime happens the most. And when you just report it as an index of violent crime, you might think that it's true violence, when in fact, the least serious kind of assault is the most common. All right, same with property crime. So that does inflate the rate in terms of it over dramatizes it when you report it, when you collapse it like that. So if you actually look at the data, you can see that is the case when they report them individually. It also ignores corporate crime. I would say that the main thing is it does so in the Part 1 offenses. It does count corporate crime in Part 2 offenses, but I think the valid criticism is that it only uses arrests in Part 2. And if you think about it, corporate crime in dollar terms costs the United States far, far, far more money than street crime. So if you go in, you get theft of any amount is counted, right? So if I go and I steal a piece of bubble gum from 7-Eleven and they bust me, or I don't know, 6-pack of beer, whatever, something small, that's counted. But if in Part 1, meaning our most serious kind of crime, but even somebody who steals millions of dollars, it's not counted in Part 1. So I think that's a legitimate criticism. There are also consistent social science studies that show that UCR reports have been manipulated for political gain, both up and down. So basically, if a politician runs on, "Hey, I've really solved our crime problems," he or she will put pressure on the police the police department to underreport crime so that their numbers look good. And conversely, the opposite has happened. I want to show that the other candidate is weak on crime, or I want to show that we need to get tough on crime, and so I could put pressure on my police department, I'm talking like mayor mostly here, to make crime look worse than it actually is. So there's been documented cases of either happening. Another criticism is that you can have false increases, and what that just means is, like, for example, when the police, if you improve your bookkeeping, it's not that the crime rate actually changed, it's just your ability to count them changed. The classic example is probably when they went from paper to computers. Computers make it really easy to compile stuff. So you just have better bookkeeping, and so you have more crimes the following year. But it's not that the crime rate went up. It's just your ability to count them improved. This is related to the other thing about corporate crime. A very valid criticism is that by focusing on only street crime as our most serious crimes, it distorts what the public considers a real crime or our most serious crimes. So it focuses on the progressives would say it focuses on crimes committed primarily by the underclass, right, or the poor, right? And to a certain extent, that's correct. Street crime is, for the most part, as an aggregate way for the group, it does occur more often amongst certain segments of society than others, and that is absolutely related to one's social status in that society. Lastly, they'll use something on I'll say one more thing. So what they say, the criticism on that is, what that means is you really fear the person who goes into the 7-Eleven and holds up a 7-Eleven, or somebody who breaks into a house and steals a computer or something. You'd think that person's a real criminal who deserves to be put in jail. But when you see some white collar criminal, somebody in a suit who steals millions or bazillions, like when they defraud corporations for millions of dollars in order to increase the stock price, etc., we don't view that person as a real criminal. They don't need real jail. We'll send them to the country club jail, so to speak. So I think that's valid. There's some truth to that. And then lastly, they use something called the time clock, and that's a joke. So basically, what it says is that last year, a choose your crime, a aggravated assault occurred every 3 minutes and 42 seconds. Well, the issue is that it compresses it into one 24-hour period. So your population, if it got bigger over the years, but the crime rate, the percentage of aggravated assault stayed the same, it would appear as though those crimes were happening more often, right? Because you have to compress those all into a 24-hour time clock, when in fact, the percentage or the crime rate stayed the same. So it makes it appear as though crime is going up when it actually is not. So whenever you hear those things in the media, I mean, it doesn't even have to be about crime, but when you hear something, every 42 seconds or whatever, ignore those, because they're based upon the base population. Okay. Next slide. Okay, eventually the UCR will be replaced. I have yet to see it cited very widely. It was supposed to be in place at the turn of the century, but as of 2001, a very small percentage of the U.S. population is represented by this new counting system. And if it's around, they are not reporting it as often. They're still using the UCR, okay, in terms of the main thing. I think really UCR should be kept. If they want to make some improvements, that's fine. But really, with the exception of murder, that does a pretty good job, and maybe motor vehicle theft, it's not really all that great, other than counting general trends over time. But for most stuff, you should look at the National Crime Victimization Survey, as you'll find in that lecture. Okay, I just took this out to give you an idea. Remember I said the least serious crimes count for the vast majority of all crimes committed? So look at the crime index offenses, right? So the ones that hurt people are very, very small percentage of the total all crime rate compared to, and then look at the least serious. Remember, larceny theft is theft or an attempted theft of any amount, and that's the vast majority of cases. Okay, so the vast majority of all crime are theft, and then burglary, then aggravated assault, which remember includes attempts. And then so that just gives you an idea, and then you can always look at the most recent version of this to get an idea.